From the 1st of April this year, all political parties will be legally required to disclose their private donors and sources of funding. On Friday, President Cyril Ramaphosa gave an update on the implementation of the Political Party Funding Act. The legislation prohibits donations to parties by foreign governments or agencies, foreign persons or entities, organs of state or state-owned enterprises. To tell us more, we're joined by Nkosikhulule Nyembezi, researcher at the Election Monitoring Network. Good to see you. Good morning.
Good morning, Leanne.
All right, talk to us about this. It's something that people have been asking for a while. How important is the implementation of this act in the South African context?
Oh, it is quite a milestone because we know that since the promulgation of the Constitution, we had this obligation that has been outstanding to ensure that everything is laid bare. There is transparency in terms of funding of political parties. And we know that this had to go to court, and thanks to my vote count for championing this together with other civil society with organizations. We know the Black Sash has been there. We know a number of organizations, and it had to go through the court to enforce it. And we were elated when the parliament passed the legislation in 2019 to say we need to have this arrangement. And we are also elated by the progress made by the Electoral Commission to put in place the mechanisms to ensure that this legislation can be implemented.
Give us an idea about, obviously, we all speculate, and we kind of know why it was important to create an act like this. I mean, we've seen a lot of instances happening, and we've seen state capture commissions and inquiries going on. But perhaps you can give us a better idea. What was actually happening behind closed doors that the public is not aware of?
Well, it's a number of things, one of which is the fact that there has been this tender system in government. You know that when political parties campaign for office, they promise to provide service delivery. But what happens largely is that political parties procure services from private companies to provide services. So they use taxpayers' money to dish out tenders. So most of the time, those who are in the office, political office, they get favors. They give favors to private companies. So you find that the provision of a tender is linked to who do you know. Mm-hmm. We have seen the evidence from the State Commission, the State Capture Commission, where we hear that political parties were provided with lots of money by private companies, something that is untoward. So we need to ensure that there is transparency in that. But we also see that political parties, the smaller ones, they are disadvantaged because even in terms of the other formula for providing for funding through Parliament, through the Electoral Commission, it is provided in a proportionate way. So largely, political parties that are big, they get a big chunk, while small parties do not get as much as they should. But also to allow for new entrants, for political parties contesting for the first time, and now it's also going to be for independent candidates. It's going to allow for facilitation of funding in a transparent way. So
how likely is it to change who funds whom in going into the usual political funding that we know of? And, to add to that, do you think that perhaps the amount of funding for political parties will start dropping now because these companies also want to remain anonymous and don't necessarily want to be part of the public sphere?
I think it's going to level the playing field to ensure that no one is getting too much by way of donations. Private companies should continue funding political parties, and I think they will continue to fund political parties. It's a good thing to do. What we also need to see changing is also in terms of that option that allows for private funders to donate anonymously. And what they donate goes into a big bag that is then distributed proportionately amongst political parties, and the distribution process is done by the Electoral Commission. So if you have an appetite to fund for elections, democracy, you can do so through the big basket that is going to be administered by the Electoral Commission and be distributed amongst all political parties, or as you may specify.
Okay. So from my understanding, and if this is what's still happening, the IEC has until the 30th of September 2022 to table the first private political party funding report in Parliament. So what will happen if our elections do go ahead this year? We're talking about the local government elections. Will this be public knowledge or not? Or do we wait until the next elections only to actually find those details out?
It will be public knowledge. It should be public knowledge. We must remember that the legislation only provides a pathway to facilitate transparency in the way in which political campaigns are funded. Political parties in themselves are supposed to voluntarily disclose as to who do they get funding from. Even the funders themselves are supposed to voluntarily disclose who are they funding in the election environment. So the report from the Electoral Commission is going to be part of a formality, but it doesn't need to stand in the way of facilitating of access to information, of disclosures, and of transparency.
And that's what I think South Africans have been calling for, is transparency. We know that the IEC held public hearings on this legislation. What were some of the views and concerns that actually came out of these hearings?
I think it's largely from the political party side, the administrative obligations that are put in place to ensure that you need to report on a regular basis. You must have a designated person within a political party who is going to ensure that they complete the forms, they submit the information, and also in terms of audited financial statements. Some of the political parties are not big enough to have that machinery of having auditors for their finances. So it's going to require a lot of innovation. It's going to require a lot of infrastructure to be put in place in order to ensure compliance. But fortunately, the timeframes that have been put in place allow for a gradual introduction and establishment of that mechanism. That is why we see that it was in 2018 that the court decision was made, and in 2019 that the legislation was passed by Parliament, and only in 2021 that we are seeing the date of its inception coming into place. So political parties have got obligation. But it also goes with the funders themselves to also say that you need to know what are the minimums and the maximums allowable, and how should you process the donation of money. So there's a lot of public education that must go into place, including when it comes to members of the public. When we want to access the information, we also need education to ensure that you know who to ask and what to look for when the reports are out.
Yeah, I mean, the presidency has now said that this legislation is going to make corruption very difficult. It is going to lead the way for transparency and accountability. Now, let's talk to that. Do you think this is a game changer? Because we've seen and heard stories, and we know that there have been many instances where, you know, we talk to, whether it be political individuals that are being paid for work, for tenders, and then big political parties. I mean, the president himself was also, or is still at the center of trying to hide the documents showing who his funders are for the election campaigns. I mean, is this a big changer? Is this a game changer in South Africa now?
It is a big changer because we have now this institutional framework in place. It is a big changer because it calls for for the execution of moral obligation by those concerned to comply with this legislation, so that it doesn't lean on the side of policing of the implementation of the legislation. Everything must happen voluntarily. It must go with accountability. It must level the playing field. So we don't expect surprises when the Electoral Commission produces those regular reports. What they produce, the Electoral Commission produces in the form of that report, should be something that we know already as the public. because political parties have disclosed voluntarily. It's going to be a game changer because we see a lot of technology in place now in terms of how the South African Revenue Services and other agencies are operating, because when you provide money to a political party, it needs to be traceable as to where it comes from. It will also show as to whether we have foreign interests that are at play in our local politics in terms of foreign donors who are providing large sums of money and what interests they want to serve. So it's going to strengthen accountability, and we want and hope for self-disclosure and accountability from the political parties.
Yeah. So, in terms of, say, I want to fund my political party, if I so choose, and, you take, for instance, something like the DA. They've got on their website, if you want to pay a monthly contribution, you can. Is this, obviously, this is just now going to be above board, but will my details now have to be available if anybody wants to see them, or is it only for those individuals or companies that donate over 100,000 Rand?
Yes, there's a minimum threshold that needs to be reportable. So if you are just an individual who's putting a small donation, whether it's part of a subscription, it needs not come out. Remember, the purpose of the legislation is to curb undue influence into our electoral system, into our electoral politics. So to the extent that some people may be putting in large sums of money, that needs to be declared, and that is what, as the public, we need to know about. So yes, there are minimum thresholds, in as much as in different categories of amounts that are donated, there is a different way of a disclosure that needs to be implemented.
All right, so wrap it up for us. So the IEC have got a lot of work ahead of them. What do they need to do? Of course, the elections are coming up. So what is the first thing they need to ensure is done from their side?
Education. We need to educate all the stakeholders involved, particularly the political parties, the South African public, so that they know exactly what this legislation means, how it operates, how to engage with it. Because when citizens know how to engage with the legislation, that is when we get to ensure accountability. When political parties and donors know how to engage with the legislation, that is when we also ensure that there is accountability and everything runs smooth. And I also think there needs to be a rhythm to ensure that when these regular reports come out, the electoral system has a way of publicizing them so that there is not just a tick box mechanism, but it is a report that gets engaged with, so that we can get to gradually improve our system. Because it's not like going to be a smooth sailing from the start. There are going to be hitches. So to ensure that we have that trust, the Electoral Commission and civil society, they need to educate the public and all stakeholders involved.
All right, we'll leave it there. Nkosikhulule Nyembezi, thank you. Thanks for talking to us from Election Monitoring Network, discussing this Party Political Funding Act. Goes into effect the 1st of April. 7 o'clock, let's get